What do you think of when you hear French cinema? You might well think highbrow art house movies, French New Wave, filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut and Jacques Demy. But let's not forget that for over 100 years now, the French have been pioneers of gruesome, macabre entertainment. In the late 1800s, French audiences would flock to Theatre Grand Guignol in Paris to see gruesome, blood-drenched live theatre performances. In early cinema, it was French director Georges Méliès who's often cited for creating the first ever horror film with The Manor of the Devil. And movies we've already discussed this series, like Les Diaboliques or Eyes Without a Face, still remain shocking and terrifying to this day.
It's true every day. It's true every day.
But it was around the turn of the millennium that a new movement in French cinema began, one that drew on its country's history in both highbrow art and grisly gore. This movement became known as New French Extremity, a term first coined by the art forum critic James Quant, who grouped together a collection of shocking, transgressive films by French directors like Claire Denis and Gaspar Noé. These were artful, thought-provoking movies made by respected French filmmakers that also happened to be some of the most shocking, gruesome and deeply upsetting movies in the history of cinema. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body, and we discuss two classics from the New French Extremity, Trouble Every Day and Inside. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 6th series exploring both body horror and psychological horror, and this is part 23. This week's episode is sponsored by $20 patron Katie Davis, and in this week's episode, we are going to be discussing, as the intro suggested, two movies from the New French Extremity, Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day, and Julienne Maury and Alexandre Boustillot's Inside from 2007. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. I know that for people in the UK, it's quite difficult to track these films down, particularly Inside. Inside doesn't seem to be streaming anywhere. It doesn't even seem to be available to rent on demand. I think the only way that you can pick it up legally is to buy a DVD, unfortunately. For Trouble Every Day, you can rent that on Mubi here in the UK for about £3, so that is available for anyone who wants to check it out. But both of these discussions will be spoilerific, and if you can give them a watch, I would urge you to check them out. So let's get into it. We've got lots to discuss, lots of nasty, upsetting subject matter to cover. Joining me to discuss all things New French Extremity, I've got a French critic with me. She's a good friend of the pod. She's been on the podcast a couple of times. She was last here with me discussing The Exorcist 3 Legion, and I'm thrilled to have her back. Welcome to the podcast, Elena Lazic. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks. I'm all right. We finally got to December, to the end of this crazy year. How has it been for you? How's 2020 been for you?
I think like everybody else, it's been quite difficult and emotional and just a bit of a roller coaster. But I think I can't really complain. I've mostly been home and just still working and watching even more films than usual, which I didn't think was possible. But here we are. So yeah, I can't complain, yeah.
I love it. So let me start off by asking you about this subgenre we're covering this series. Specifically, I suppose, relevant to this week is body horror. And not just body horror, but the more extreme ends of horror cinema and extreme graphic body horror. What are your thoughts on that kind of area of the genre?
Well, it's funny because actually, I didn't think it was ever for me at all. Like just a few years ago, not even that long ago. But then me and my boyfriend and some friends, they're really into the Saw franchise, which I think probably counts, because it's all like traps and like body.
Totally,
I mean,
it's all like
count,
sawing
right?
off limbs and all sorts.
Yeah, traps and things. So, and I used to be so scared, like of any images of horror or like gore on screen, but like to an insane degree. I just couldn't watch the screen. And now after watching these films over and over again, which are they're not the best made body horror films, but they're still quite upsetting. And after watching, it's just amazing to me that in just a few years, I've managed to actually reach the point where I can just watch that without blinking. So yeah, but whether I enjoy it, I don't know that it would be like my absolute favorite part of horror cinema, but I do actually once in a while like to watch a really upsetting horror film, because I feel like it just shakes me up a bit and like wakes me up a little bit, and I actually really enjoy. I used to be afraid of that sensation, but now I actually seek it.
I love it. Yeah, well, I'm the same as you actually, but I remember when I think it was the first time we ever chatted on the podcast, and we were talking about Straw Dogs and that kind of stuff, and you were telling me then, I think, that you loved Trouble Every Day, or at least that you found it one of the more sort of frightening movies you've seen, because that is a film that, and we'll get into this, I find incredibly disturbing and upsetting. Yeah. And let me, what we're about to start talking about on the podcast for the next couple of weeks is sort of French horror, particularly that sort of 10-ish year era from the late 90s through to the late noughties that people now call the new French Extremity. Movies like Irreversible, Martyrs, obviously Inside, Calvaire, Frontiers. What are your thoughts on these movies?
Well, I actually went through a period where I just watched loads of them because my thinking was I'd rather watch them all at once and then sort of be done with it, which sort of contradicts what I just said before. But at the time, I wasn't really used to gore as much. And I love these films. Like, I have to say, I think it's just so... they're just incredibly exciting. Like, some of them I think are like not as good as the others. I think Trouble Every Day is probably my favorite of that entire mini genre. But I think they just allow for... I'm going to talk about this probably throughout the entire conversation that we're going to have. But I think what's so thrilling about them is that they sort of reach like another kind of sensation in cinema, which is beyond being disgusted. It's beyond being scared and beyond this. It's just something completely different, where it just completely engages you physically in the film. In a way that I know, like, obviously some slasher films from America and things also have like gore and moments of horror and terror, but I feel like the French extremism, because of this emphasis on detail and just the most upsetting things you can imagine, it just really reaches another level, and I find that just absolutely just so exciting. And but it's, for me, so I mean, it's kind of, there's also conversations about whether some of these films fall into art house cinema as well.
Definitely.
And I feel like that's actually a really, really good question, because I feel like the things that they achieve and reach through are like beyond, they achieve like a real sensation, which I feel like is more about what art house cinema tries to be about a lot, which is something that's more, maybe less literal, less logical.
Yeah, I find that really interesting as well, sort of where these films lie on the sort of art house, grindhouse spectrum, I suppose. And I think the way that they have kind of evolved, I guess, across that period, because if you look at Trouble Every Day as one of the earlier movies in this kind of movement, and it is, I would say, more on the art house end of the spectrum. And then when you go to Inside and Martyrs at the end of the decade, they're much more like proper genre films, aren't they? I think they have scares and jump scares and that kind of thing. And it's interesting what you said, that they go kind of beyond just being scary or gory. They tip over into something more than that. I agree with you. It's I think a word that a lot of people use when they talk about French extreme horror is transcendent, or it goes beyond transgressive and into transcendence. And I think that's something that Martyrs, as the kind of end point of this movement, really kind of literally demonstrates in its story. But I think it's something that all of these French movies dabble in, isn't it? It's something beyond just scary horror.
Yeah.
Why do you think this happened? How did this movement suddenly happen? What was the reason behind this particular trend of these particular movies in France at this time, do you think?
I think it's complicated, but I think as a general rule, I think I think that if you think of like the end of the 90s, like and the beginning of the noughties around the world, I think it was a time of a lot of cinema was very, very intense and really searching. And I feel like I wrote this piece a while ago about some American 90s cinema, like popular films like The Matrix and things. And so many of those films are about people being dissatisfied with their everyday life and how actually you can be leading a really normal looking life, but actually it's like horrible. It's a nightmare. You're probably asleep right now. You don't even know, and you're in a box, and you're actually being fed to a robot. You know, the idea that even the normal reality you're in is actually hellish, I think reached like an absolute apex near at the turn of the millennium, really. And that's why you also had all these films about the devil and like coming to Earth and having a child on Earth and stuff. And I think these are all these things. And I think in France, it seems to me like the wave of French extremism is sort of related to this, but it's like sort of going in a different direction, where instead of going into like sort of, almost conspiracy theory, like what is real, like am I in a simulation and things, it's more going into the absolute horror of everyday things that are bodies, which are just us.
Yeah.
And you don't need, I really like how especially in Inside, it's like there's basically almost no set design or setting. It's just people in a room, and that's horrible, and that's it. And I feel like it's almost like those filmmakers at the time, they went looking for this anxiety and like exploiting this anxiety at a more like internal level, rather than looking at our society. We live in a society and everything's fucked up. It's more about like we are all like rotten inside and things like this.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's something, they feel quite timeless in that regard as well, don't they? Like they don't really age, because they're not specifically about, like you said, they're not about really society or politics kind of overtly at the time. They're a little bit more universal in a way and more human, but they're essentially about pain. I think pain, because I was thinking about what makes these films so much more, I find, so much more upsetting than, for example, what people call torture porn in the American cinema happening at the time, like Saw, like Eli Roth's Hostel and those sorts of films. And these movies, it's less about the gore, but there's something that is really focusing in on pain, I think, that really gets to me, that really kind of freaks me out. There's just a kind of bleakness, isn't there, about them? I think it's like a tonal thing.
Yeah, it's really really upsetting. Like, I think there's actually, in these two films we're going to talk about, I think what these two films really get really well, and I think probably all of French extremism, is what's really scary is obviously what happens is horrible and stuff, but it's really the sense of losing control and losing your mind.
Yes.
And being completely at the mercy of whoever's decided to ruin your life today and kill you and things. And I feel like that's, to a certain degree, actually, I think Eli Roth Hostel does that a bit, but there's all this story and like trying to escape, whereas these films are more about like, nah, you're there, you can't really go anywhere. And there's really this sense of like being like, oh, I thought I could control things and I can't control anything.
Absolutely. And I think, and I'm going to talk about this on the podcast in a couple of weeks, but with films like Hostel, they feel a little bit more like slasher movies, like sort of Friday night movies. The same with Saw, like you were saying, like you can watch them with your friends and have a bit of a laugh. And I think the films are supposed to be that. They're supposed to be quite cathartic and fun. Again, I don't feel like the violence in these French ones is cathartic and fun. It's like, again, it's like really upsetting in a good way. But then also I kind of think, well, in some ways, does that make them more moral? They kind of treat violence as kind of upsetting as it should be, in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was thinking actually, yesterday I watched Inside. And I was thinking, like, what happens when you watch these films is that you're basically torn in two between your intellect telling you this isn't real, this is a film, this is just some scenario created by a person, and like everything is fine, and then your physical reaction. And I feel like that's way more. I mean, that's the case with every film you watch, every horror film. But I feel like in these films, there's a degree where you just lose control of even your mind is not enough to reassure you. Whereas in Hostel or in all those films, you can be like, yeah, it's all fake. And even the scenario within the film is a bit far-fetched.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, the Saw franchise, the scenario is very far-fetched.
It's amazing.
So you always have this thing to fall back on that's like reassuring. Whereas these films, because they're, in a way, they're more realistic. I think we have to talk about how the sort of cinematography, or the French extremism film, which is so like almost documentary-like and like very like gritty and like just, you know, capturing people as they are. And often with like quite bad actors, which I think adds to the effect. That's
interesting. Yeah.
And I feel like it's way more about like, you can't fall back on narrative. You can't fall back on whatever bad logical narrative explanation.
Yeah, that's right. It's like all emotion, isn't it? It plays on your emotions. So with all that in mind, then let's talk about Trouble Every Day then from 2001.
To Mr. and Mrs. Brown.
Welcome to Paris, Mrs. Brown. I hope you'll enjoy your stay.
No, Dr. Semino doesn't work here anymore.
Look into my eyes.
I really need to find him.
You see trouble every day.
He just up and left.
His wife is sick.
Sun inside.
Corey's sick?
He is very sick.
Get inside you. You can blow such your slightest breath. And I know
You were in love with her? It's not the right word for it.
and this trouble every day. This trouble every day.
So, I'll try as best I can to kind of summarize the plot. It's quite a strange, sort of loose plot, isn't it? But really, it's the story of two couples. So we've got Shane and June, an American couple, who are sort of traveling over to Paris on their honeymoon. And then we've got another couple, Cora and Leo, French couple, living in Paris. And what connects these two couples is that in each couple, one of them happens to be a cannibal. Cora is caged in this house like she's a caged animal. Her husband Leo keeps her locked up because whenever she does get out, she seduces men and then violently kills them and eats them. Meanwhile, Vincent Gallo's character is a little bit more under control. He is out and about with his wife, kind of seeming normal, but he is also kind of fantasizing about, you know, violently attacking women, including his wife. He's trying to control it and suppress it, but by the end of the film, he is unable to control his cannibalistic urges. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We'll go into it in a bit more depth. But first of all, Elena, let me ask you, what's your own personal history and relationship with this film?
I think I actually watched it for the first time at uni. In a week where we watched this and some other French extremism film, which was quite upsetting. And it was, but I stayed. I watched it. Like, we didn't have to. I remember the teacher was like, "You can get out if you don't want to," and I was like, "No, I will be brave. I will face this." And and I've seen it several times since. And yeah, I mean, I've actually never seen it at the cinema, which is really sad. But at the same time, I'm kind of, in a secret part of my mind, I'm kind of glad about that, because I don't know how I would deal with this, because no matter how many times I see that film, I think it's almost more upsetting every time, because you know what's coming and you know you're not ready. Like, it's because I feel like there's it goes back to what I was saying, where it's like those films, they just go beyond fear and things. It's like there's a degree to where you just can't rationalize anything or your sensations. So no matter how many times I watch this scene, I know it's not real, and I know it's like all effects and really well shot and things, but like there's always a part of me that's just, my body just refuses to really engage with those images, so it's very upsetting. But that's part of the thrill. So yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I saw it relatively late. I only saw it for the first time about 2 years ago, and I think it was actually, I didn't see it at the cinema, but I remember Anna and Olivia, the final girls, I think they put on a screening of it. I think it was the first screening they hosted actually at the BFI, and I missed it, but then I'd heard so much talk about it, and I had so many of my friends telling me about how good this film was that I checked it out, and I found it deeply upsetting. I don't know again what it is about these French extreme films. You know, I'm pretty good with extreme stuff these days. I mean, we've just been doing a whole series of extreme movies on Patreon. I've been watching Cannibal Holocaust, Salo, Guinea Pig. I'm like, yeah, I can handle all this. You know, none of that stuff affected me in the way that this film affected me. This film, along with movies like Martyrs and Irreversible, there's something about these French movies that really, really fucking upset me, and I don't know what it is. We'll work our way through it. It's going to be like therapy for me, but this film really did get to me. So before we get into it in depth, let me ask you briefly about Claire Denis. Claire Denis, who directed this movie, you know, she's got much more of a kind of art house reputation. She's not really done that much other horror, but what do you think of Claire Denis generally as a director?
Oh yeah. I adore her films. Like I actually was really lucky because I interviewed her like I think 2 years ago when.
Oh my god! So
Sophie did the season.
How was she with you? Because I interviewed her and she was absolutely terrifying, and she was she was horrible to me. It was one of my worst experiences of interviewing anybody ever. But I've heard that she can sometimes be really nice, and she gets like good days and bad days apparently. So
I've heard that too actually. And I was lucky because I think she was all right. She was quite nice to me. Good. But I had been prepared for it. Like I've been told. I watched interviews where she's like openly like quite cold and rude. But I think that's what I like about. I mean, it's horrible. Like I'm not condoning her being mean to people, but I think I like that about her is that she really absolutely does not care.
She doesn't give a shit.
Of how she comes across at all. She just wants to talk about. She just cares about her films and what she's saying in the interview, and like it's kind of. And I feel like that's actually an attitude that's quite visible in the films as well. Like she's got such how do you say, quite fearless approach. Like she's really not trying to make it easy for the audience at all. I don't think she's even thinking about the audience when she's making her films. And it's more about like creating an experience, and she stays in the moment, and it's all very. I think that's what you mentioned about the fact that Trouble Every Day, you don't really know what it's about or what the story is. I think it's because it's not really about the story. It's more about the experience and like the sensations that happen and being in that world for, 2 hours or something. And so it's almost like the story. I almost feel like, I mean, there are loads of films that way, but I feel especially in this film, it's almost like the story, you know, the married couple going to Paris or something like, okay, who cares? The science stuff is like, what? It really doesn't matter. It's more like she just decided on this story to then create those images and those things, and the actual like narrative of it is just so secondary to everything. That's what I really like about it.
She is a really great director. I love. I think my favorite is what was the one that she did really recently? High Life. I think that might be my favorite of hers actually. And I was thinking about kind of. What makes a Claire Denis film? Like, I don't know, like kind of how you could define Claire Denis' filmmaking style. And I think you're right, like that, it's that kind of like working on mood maybe as well. And kind of, there's something also I think really sort of tactile about her movies, you know, really sensory and sensual. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, the way that she films love-making scenes in movies like Friday Night, Vendredi Soir, and some of her other movies. Extreme close-ups on body parts and touching. Obviously, High Life, which is kind of you'd think would be this kind of cold sci-fi film set in space, is actually incredibly sexy, and there's lots of fluids and all kinds of stuff. And even Trouble Every Day, right? It's a grim, disturbing horror movie, but there is something very sensual and sensory and tactile about it, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think she's just such an amazing filmmaker for the fact that actors and things are material things, they're not just images. I was just thinking about this today for some reason, but like just, you know, when you live your life, you're always aware of like the sensation and of the fact that there are things around you, and like you're in a place and a place has a mood. But then when you make a film, it can be really easy to lose that and to just focus on the story and the characters' intentions and what they're doing. And she really doesn't do that. She's really about just capturing the actual feeling of a place and somehow finding the images that can make you feel the place. And there's all these shots, obviously, in Trouble Every Day of like the blood on the walls and on the bodies. And and so much like obscurity, which immediately gives you the sensation of like something more like, you know, closed off and maybe warm, or maybe just, you know, less clarity. I think there's also shadows, and she works a lot with shadows and things, and shadows obviously, you know, any absence of light just makes the texture of things come out. And she's just, I don't think she's even necessarily conscious of what she's doing, like, because she's such a genius.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so hard to like write about and talk about, but she really brings out the texture of things and of actors and things. And
yeah. I love that. I do love that. That's something we talked about quite a lot on this podcast about David Lynch too, I think, as a similar thing, where he works on instinct and not necessarily logic. Like he will shoot or edit something that feels right depending on what he's trying to put across. And he's not really worried about whether or not that makes any sense necessarily. And I think like as soon as you know that when you're watching it, and you know that you just like enjoy it for that sort of sensory experience, I suppose, then I think you get more out of it. What do you sort of, what do you think Trouble Every Day is really about? Like, what is Claire Denis sort of doing with this story, do you think? What story is she telling?
Well, I think what's really interesting about the film, I think, is that it's also like a love story. And so I think the film is all about seduction and attraction and desire, but also about like almost about the selfishness of desire. I mean, there's nothing more selfish than a vampire who wants to suck someone's blood, but then that means the person dies. And I think that there's also the entire film almost is like, you got throughout the film, there's also amazing sound design, which is another thing she does really well. Where there's always this like constant like rumbling sound on the soundtrack. It's never really silent or anything. There's always a little rumble, and I feel like it obviously it's like it hypnotizes the viewer into being like, what's going on? But also I think it's almost like the rumbling of the hunger of the cannibals and like this desire, and there's always this tension basically where these two vampires are constantly looking for someone to eat, and there's this constant desire, but there's also the tension of the people who love them. So there's the fiancée who loves her new husband, Vincent Gallo, and there's the guy who locks up his wife in his house because she's a vampire. So I think it's about that. I think it's about the tension between and the very real but also like imaginary limit between yourself and other people. I mean, I don't want to get too far-fetched, but you know, like when you want somebody, it's for yourself, but you also want the other person. And what a cannibal is in the film is someone who wants the other person so much that they go through the person, like they literally destroy their skin. And it's about those barriers, those limits between me and another person, and me and other things. And like I think it's amazing because the cinema of Claire Denis is always about blurring the boundaries between things, and like, you know, making in this film Friday Night, it's about this woman who's like casually hooks up with some guy she just saw while she was in a traffic jam, and there's all these shots of like just the sand, you know, the water or the walls of things, and it's about like the fluidity of things and the way that things, you know, obviously that woman is like cheating on her boyfriend or whatever, and she doesn't know this man, but you know, in the moment there's no those barriers of society that say she shouldn't do this and stuff are disappearing. And I think what makes Trouble Every Day fit with her other films which are not really horror films at all. They're quite art house, as you say, about people and things. What makes that film fit with her films is that it's still about the fluidity of things, but also about the limits of that, and about those characters who actually, by transgressing, they transgress a limit that's taboo. Cannibalism. It's like you can't do that. That's another rule of society that you just can't go for. It's way more extreme than just sleeping with a stranger that you just saw when you were in a traffic jam. And so I think that's what it's about. I think it's about the tension between those boundaries and what makes it great as well is that it becomes so literal when there's literally someone eating a person. So it's brilliant.
Yeah, there's something really interesting about it, isn't there? That I find it uncomfortable and confrontational because I think it confronts something in all of us as human beings. And I know people, psychologists, probably Freud has talked about this idea that we almost want to eat something that we love, right? I mean, when you look at how adults act around babies, they always kind of go, oh, I want to eat you up, and they kind of make those little gestures, like, you know, funny little gestures, like they want to eat them. And there is, you know, that theory, isn't there, that inside of us all there is that urge to want to eat what we find cute or attractive or what we love. And this film really kind of, in a really uncomfortable, frightening way, really pushes that instinct in us, I think. The way that Claire Denis films the kill scenes, especially, that they're kind of, it just rides the line between kind of sensual and extremely violent, and it's a really uncomfortable, upsetting thing. Yeah,
exactly. And it's amazing because it's not even a new idea, you know, vampires. I mean, that's what vampires are about. But the way Claire Denis does it, it just makes it feel, she just, you know, it's such an old idea of like vampires, you know, and she just makes it fresh. She just tries to, even though the story is like weird and like these people are not very necessarily believable. I don't know why Vincent Gallo is this American man in Paris. It's just weird, you know. But even though it's so strange and those characters are weird and the story is far-fetched, like she just manages to bring the idea of the vampire back to like the actual visceral level of it, which is absolutely terrifying.
I think that's what it is, and it's funny because I've never really thought about it as a vampire film, but you're right. I mean, it is. I think because though it feels like it's so set in the real world about real people. In my head, I always just think of it as they're just these fucked up cannibals rather than vampires. And somehow, if you have like vampires on film, it's like, it makes it a little bit more safe, doesn't it, in a way? Because you're kind of like, oh, they're like fantastical creatures and that's what they do. They suck blood, and it's somehow a bit more, I don't know, it's more acceptable that it can be a bit sensual and exciting and stuff. Whereas, like you said, cannibalism is still one of the last big taboos, I think, in cinema for some reason. It's still something that we really struggle to see on screen. Yeah. Like, I was thinking of another French film from a few years ago that we're going to be covering later in this series, Raw. Do you remember Juliette Ducournau's Raw? And all the stories of people like fainting in cinemas and being carried out and stuff as well, because again, it's like, it's that weird thing of biting into and eating human flesh that people just can't handle. It's really interesting.
It's just really upsetting, I think, because there's this idea that in both films, actually, in Raw and in Trouble Every Day, it's like it happens at the moment of intimacy, which is supposed to be, you know, gentle. Like you don't want to hurt someone, and suddenly this person is like almost like there's something really selfish about it that's really cruel and just really upsetting. That they just forget about the sense of shared experience and they just bite into the other person, and so it just becomes something. It's like both very upsetting and very sad, and just it's just a lot. It's just so intense. There's so much going on in such a. It's like one thing that happens, but there's so much going on with it. There's so much that we associate with just these ideas alone. Like just the image of someone eating someone else is just so wrong on some level that we almost can't express because it's just such a basic taboo.
Yes. Yeah. What do you think is, how do you find that dynamic? Let's talk about the two couples. And first of all, sort of Vincent Gallo's character then and his wife, there's that strange moment on the plane when he has to sort of take himself away to the toilet, right? And he has that sort of almost vision of his wife sort of covered in blood. Do you kind of see this as like, is it him sort of avoiding being tempted, I suppose, like trying his very, very best not to act on his desires and kill and eat her? Do you think that's what's going on with this couple?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think it's interesting because it's almost like he's like the other cannibal in the film. He's a cannibal, but he's got it. He doesn't have it under control, but he knows what sort of. He's not like given up on it. He still wants to be a person, and he just wants to like deal with it as best as he can. And he loves. It's interesting how. There's almost, it's not so much that there's a difference between the way he loves this woman and the way he wants to eat her, but he knows that he can't eat her. It's not like a dichotomy. It's not like the one you can either love someone or you want to eat them or whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting because he would like to, but it's almost like he loves her too much to do it or something.
Exactly that. I think that's true,
which is so romantic. Like he basically sacrifices himself to keep her alive in a way.
I know, and I find it really fun because it is, I suppose, again, it's not something I thought about when I watched this, that it's romantic, but I guess it is. I was talking to a couple of friends about this film, and it's amazing how many of my female friends love this film, you know. And whenever I speak to anyone about it, they always say to me, oh, it's really beautiful, it's really romantic, which again, I kind of never really saw, but I guess in some ways you could look at it that way. This film does seem to really speak to a female audience. Do you think that there is something in particular about that, about the fact that it's made by a woman, about the fact that it's got a female lens, a female eye? Do you think that that adds something to this story, you know, compared to if it had been made by a man, for example?
I don't know. Well, it's difficult to answer these kind of questions anyway, because it's not like we could ever find out what Gladney would do if she was not a woman. It's like, But I think there's actually something through all her films. I think is something. One of the things that she does is she confronts fear. All her films are like about something scary and about people just not being brave, and they say, I'm brave, I'm doing this, but like all her characters are, I think, like always basically terrified and doing things they wouldn't normally do. And like even she did a sort of rom-com called Let the Sunshine In, which is also about a character who's just terrified, who's like petrified by the fact that she's alone, and she's always crying, and sometimes she's happy, and she's like panicking. Her film White Material, about a woman on a plantation in Africa, is also about someone who's really scared. She's too scared. She doesn't want to go away. She doesn't want to abandon the place. And so I think maybe this idea of a director who's so concerned with fear, but also love, because all her films also have these notions of love, even High Life in a really weird way.
Definitely.
And I feel like maybe that could be something that if you're a woman and if you're living in the world where you're maybe oppressed in a way that maybe men are not, maybe you're more likely to be into these ideas and into exploring these ideas, and into if you're a female director in a largely male industry, maybe you're more scared. And so you're more likely to make films about that. But I don't know. I feel like also what's really interesting is that if you look at Claire Denis, she's always like, she's such a badass. Like she's wearing she's wearing leather jackets and things. I mean, she's so intimidating. And so I think like it's not like she's not like super feminine in the basic sense that you think, you know. So there's also that level that's like sort of not an aggression, but there's like a real confrontation element to it, which maybe we don't associate too much with women. So I don't know. I don't think that men cannot appreciate Denis films anyway. It's almost like she's a bridge between all those things. It's like she makes all these ideas of like fear and stuff feel so palatable, and like she makes you feel the things that our characters feel. So whoever you are, I think you can sort of relate on some level, even if you don't really know what's going on in the film.
Totally,
you can sort of be like, oh, I get it. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. So Vincent Gallo's character is, you know, he's kind of in some ways sort of until the end maybe he's pretty sort of high functioning, like he's managing to control himself and appear quote unquote normal for the majority of the film, right? Whereas then we go to this other couple, Leo and Cora, and she is a really different sort of case, isn't she? Like I don't think she has any actual dialogue in the whole film, does she? And she's pretty much this like caged animal essentially throughout this whole film. It's almost like she's the more extreme version of him somehow, isn't she? What do you think of her and the way her character's portrayed, and the way this couple kind of this couple dynamic as well?
I think it's like really it's one of the more fast. It's also quite romantic actually, if you think about it, because her husband keeps her locked up as out of love, and he spends his whole time out whenever he's not in the mansion that they live in. He's working on trying to find a cure for what she's got. So But I think it's really interesting because I think if I remember well, if he gave that illness to her or something accidentally. And so there's already that sort of idea of guilt. Like he feels obviously very guilty for what she's done. And I think the fact that he keeps her locked up and that she doesn't try to fight what she's got, it's very heartbreaking, because it almost feels like knowing that she could like help herself if she wanted to, the way Shane does. It almost feels like she's letting herself go and being a cannibal out of spite for her husband, because she's so mad at him or something for letting that happen. and 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 she probably also resents the idea that she has to not go outside and like be an animal and never see anyone, and she's all alone all day. So I think there's a lot of like resentment going on in that relationship, which is really interesting, and which I think is like a way that the film, even if it's such a crazy scenario and like not real, I think the way the film makes you feel that resentment and those really complex emotions and the intensity of this relationship, it's almost like it gets you anyway, because everybody can relate to those emotions. It's just that they're brought to like this sort of genre level. I mean, that's my interpretation. I feel like whoever's watching the film could have a sort of different reading of that relationship, but to me, after watching a few times and like thinking about it a lot, because you can't not think about that movie, I feel like there's all these like complex emotions at work, whereas the relationship between Shane and his wife June is much more simple and naive, because they're young, they just got married, and you get the sense that with Cora and Leo, it's like they've been married a long time and they know each other, and there's almost this like, oh, I know what you're like.
yeah.
There's this sort of honesty.
That is really interesting, because I think I thought of it more in the way that is Leo kind of too controlling of Cora, and has he made her more of a monster because of that? Like you say, like kind of making her a caged animal, has that made her turn into an animal in a way? Because like if you look at Shane and June, and she's much more passive, isn't she? I mean, she doesn't really, she doesn't even really seem to know, I don't think, that what's going on in Shane's head, but also she's very much kind of leaves him to his own devices, and you know, ultimately, does that mean that he's able to just, I mean, he's still doing the stuff, he still does it at the end, doesn't he, in that really kind of disturbing moment.
Yeah.
But other than that, he's able to still kind of live his life in a way, whereas the way that Leo has kind of had to control his wife and lock her up, has that made her into more of a monster? Who knows, you know? But it's really interesting looking at it in the flip side, in that actually, are they doing all these things because they love each other? And because, yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because she is, you know, she's clearly dangerous, she's clearly violent. Like, you see her attack pretty much every man she comes across except for her husband, right? And then she clearly can control herself, because when Leo is in the apartment, in the mansion with her, she's all like relaxed, and they have that kind of like sweet intimate scene together and stuff. So it's like, yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? That dynamic of when she's more quote unquote monstrous and when she's like more subdued and everything. Yeah,
that's why I think it's like, you could also look at it, which would fit everything that we've just said. It's also looking at it as like, because she's a woman, she's the one who's like controlled by the husband, whereas Shane is a man, so he's free and he can control himself, and he doesn't have his wife who's like condescending to him, being like, you can't control yourself, I have to lock you up. So that's why I think and you're right, when she meets Shane, she's not attacking him, and she's almost like, I get the sense that they know that they're like kindred souls and that they have something in common. But also I think there's that sense that she meets a man who isn't like, doesn't want anything from her really, and he's not looking at her like she's a monster necessarily, and she hasn't had that in a while.
It's almost treated a bit like an addiction, I think, isn't it? That's what it feels like to me. These are a couple of drug addicts and the way in which that affects their loved ones and the way that their loved ones deal with it. In the one case, we've got the really extreme version of somebody going cold turkey, right, and literally being locked in a room and just distancing themselves from any temptation and the violent consequences that could potentially have. And then we have this other case where this wife is maybe choosing to remain a bit more ignorant to it, or leaving her husband to his own devices, who is secretly going off and having these urges and having this vice, I suppose, which ultimately ends up pretty violent as well at the end. And it has these really violent consequences in the way that drug movies often do, like Requiem for a Dream, which we covered a couple of weeks ago. So that stuff's really interesting as well. So let's talk a little bit about the horror in this film. There are two scenes in particular of extreme, very upsetting horror. The first one is, of course, Cora attacking the two boys that break into her house. So this scene begins with these two boys breaking in. I'm guessing they're intending to burgle the house, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because it's like a mansion. I don't know why she lives in this like really quite nice mansion.
I know.
It feels almost like, it actually feels like almost maybe a callback to like old vampire films or something. Like, why would
like she's locked in a castle or locked in a tower or something, isn't she? Yeah. And these two boys break in, I'm assuming to burgle or to rob the house, and then they discover this sexy, seductive woman upstairs locked in this room, literally bars, and they end up sort of breaking her out. One of them breaks her out so that he can have sex with her, and they begin having sex until suddenly that sex becomes very, very violent and nasty as she begins literally eating him. What do you think of that scene?
Well, that's the scene that's the most upsetting thing I've ever seen. That's
Me
why
too.
I say that this film is the most upsetting, because it's just horrible, because it starts like I don't think they really speak to each other that much. Like when he's trying to get through the door, there's just they both are like insanely horny or something. He doesn't care about the fact that she's locked up in the room, like
Exactly.
He doesn't think, oh, there must be a reason why she's being kept in this room. He just wants to go and like be with her for some reason. So I mean that's really interesting in itself. It's like, why would he be so like blindly attracted to this woman? And it starts from almost like quite I wouldn't say it's really sexy, because it's too like already too weird and strange, like the way it happens. But then the moment when she sort of transgresses the limits of what's acceptable, and like I think she bites him like the shoulder or something. And I mean, I think she eats him. She bites loads of times afterwards, but then she plays with his skin. Which is that is like the most horrible thing I've ever seen. Like, why is it so upsetting? I don't. It's almost it's a bit difficult to explain, because it's not like it's the first time that we see a character with like their skin like that.
It's worse. You're absolutely right. There's something about it it's so lingering as well. It goes on and on and on, and like, it's the build up to it as well. It's the build up. Like again, it's that weird like fine line between what's kind of sensual and then what's violent, because when they're sort of having sex, she starts sort of biting him on the lip, and that biting starts to become more aggressive, doesn't it? And already I'm going, oh my god. And then the biting into him, and then how slowly she literally, like you said, she plays with her food, right? She just like plays with flaps of skin, and like, oh god. And then it goes on till later, and you can hear him like he's still alive, like when she's then full blown eating him later on, and it's like she hasn't even killed him, she hasn't even put him out of his misery, she just keeps going. It's absolutely horrendous.
That's why you're right, it's shot in this almost like it was a normal scene or something. It's shot like it's like a normal, it's not even shot like a normal sex scene, because usually sex scene is they're shot like crossfades and things and stuff. It's just like the camera's just there, but I think one thing that makes it really upsetting is that it's quite realistic makeup. We have to mention that. I mean, I wouldn't know. I haven't seen that, but it feels way more realistic than even like whatever American slasher films do. Like, and also just the lighting is different. Like, there's also the sense that because it's quite dark, so you have to like sort of strain to see, and then you see, and you're like, I wish I hadn't seen.
Oh my god, yeah.
It's just unbearable. It's just the most upsetting thing I've ever seen. But also, you're right, the fact that it just starts with this, the fact that it starts with him like going to her and like liberating her. You're like, oh wow, there these two people meeting, like it's beautiful. On a certain level, you're thinking, wow, he's like saving her in a way. Yeah. You're not thinking he's going to be murdered and whatever. Yeah. And then suddenly it just becomes about her getting what she wants, and he doesn't figure in. It seems like she doesn't think about him at all. And because she's the one who's alive, and I think she's the one who's on top, like we're sort of aligned with her perspective in a way. I mean, we're not aligned with her perspective because she's insane, but like we're more thinking about her, and we suddenly realize like, oh, she's not like us. She's not like a normal person. She's not a character we can understand. And she this person who was a person is now just a piece of meat for her.
Also, it's so upsetting because of how she is as well, because actually also she's not like villainous monster where she's like really enjoying it. I think she is enjoying it initially, but then you kind of see that she looks like she's sort of crying and screaming, and sort of she lets out this kind of horrible kind of visceral noise like that sounds like she's really upset as well. Like it's like she's had a relapse almost again. It's like it's going back to that addict idea. I think that she knows what she's doing is wrong, but she can't stop. So she's really upset and he's screaming and there's like blood and bits of skin everywhere, and it's just one of the most upsetting things. And I think again, it's like you said at the beginning of this conversation, it doesn't feel like a horror film either, does it? This is an art house film, and I think it just takes you by surprise at like this kind of, I don't know, this kind of avant-garde Claire Denis film about these kind of romantic couples then suddenly throws this at you. It's like that makes it even more uncomfortable, I think, because you kind of don't really know what film you're watching and what genre you're in and stuff, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Because it's like, I mean, it's not like you really know what you're watching before that as well, because it's so weird. It's like, you're just the whole time you're just like, what am I watching? And then this happens, you're like, okay, what am I watching? Like I have no idea. It doesn't clarify things, you know. It just makes things more confusing and strange.
I know,
and weird.
I know. What even does the title "Trouble Every Day" mean? Do you think? Like, what does that relate to?
Well, I think it's taken from a song called "Trouble Every Day," but like when I looked it up, it's like from the Frank Zappa's band called "Trouble Every Day," but the song is about someone witnessing riots, you know, the Watts riots, and saying there's trouble every day. So it's not really related. So I don't, unless there's another song called that, but I didn't find it.
Because there is a song through the opening credits, the Tindersticks "Trouble Every Day" as well. But again, I don't, because she works with the Tindersticks for most of her films. They do the music for most of her movies, and I don't know whether it was like that was written for the film. So I don't know whether the title came first or the song came first. But yeah, it's interesting because even the title doesn't necessarily suggest, like, it doesn't sound like, oh, this is an extreme, you know, it's not like Cannibal Holocaust or something, is it?
No, that's true. I guess we could think like maybe it's relating to the fact that every day they have to fight the impulse. So, but it's that's quite a continuous explanation. I don't know.
It's difficult, isn't it, to know? But I do like that idea that maybe the song itself, the original song, had some sort of, if it had some sort of social or political context, you know, maybe this film is saying something bigger, but in this very small, contained story, which I think so many new French extreme films do. So that's interesting. So the last scene I want to talk to you about is the other really nasty cannibal scene right at the end. Right, this is when Vincent Gallo's character has somewhat of a relapse. He gives into his urge, and we've seen throughout the film shots of this woman that works at this hotel, this kind of maid character, and they've been sort of making eye contact and looking at each other, and it seems like they're attracted to each other. And then this sequence, they finally sort of come together. And like the other one, it begins as a sex scene, right? It begins as an oral sex scene and then becomes a cannibal scene. Yeah,
that's. I think that's the kind of the two scenes. This one is just too upsetting to even think about, so I just sort of erased it from my mind. It's interesting because it sort of starts like the same way. Like there's the sense that it's something, you know, almost nice. Like it's less of a, like, they're less animalistic from the beginning. Like, because in the other scene with Beatrice Dalle, it's like they're so crazy with desire, like they jump on each other and they don't know each other. Whereas this girl, I think he's been sort of looking at her for a while, and it's almost romantic. It's way more sort of romantic seeming than the other scene. And so then I feel like when he attacks her, he's in the act of like cunnilingus, and it's like, and he's like supposedly giving her pleasure. And the fact that he eventually, you're almost rooting for him, you know, you're like, oh yeah, it's fine. Like he's still being nice, even though he's like cheating on his girlfriend or his wife, but he's being sort of sweet. And so then when you find out that he's not being sweet and that he attacks her, it's almost like it's heartbreaking for me, because it's like, God, like he couldn't, even though he was almost trying to like be nice or something, you actually don't know. Maybe this whole time he was planning on attacking this woman, and maybe there was nothing nice about him, and maybe it's just part of him. He can't help himself. He's always going to be a bad person, because even if he tries to be nice to someone, he can't do it, or he doesn't want to do it. It's like there's this whole question of like, you're wondering in this moment, like, oh, like, is he just a bad person?
Yeah.
Like, or is he really overcome by his desire, or what? Like, you can't tell how much of it is he decides, he chooses. And so it's really heartbreaking in a way, because this whole time you're like, oh, he's trying to find a solution and stuff, and here he fails. And it's not just that you're like sad for him that he fails, because obviously he's been trying not to do that. It's also that you're just wondering like, oh, it doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day whether he does it willingly or not, because people die.
He's still killing somebody, exactly. But I think you're right that there's that sense of shame afterwards. Like, he's showering, and it's the same with like we just talked about with Cora, with Beatrice Dalla's character, where she cries out, and there's this feeling of shame after they've done it. And I think it's just a very hard thing to sit with us when we watch it in a film, isn't it? And I always remember it's like similarly other provocative kind of directors like Lars von Trier. I remember one of the things that shocked so many people in Lars von Trier's film Nymphomaniac is where there's that moment when she performs oral sex on a paedophile, and she's like, oh, I feel really sorry for the paedophiles of the world, because they can't help the way they feel, and yet they have to live every day and kind of suppress their urges, and they have to they know that what they feel is wrong, and they have to obey that. And I think there's something and that's a very hard thing, I think, for people of healthy dispositions to watch on film and kind of feel sorry for paedophiles. And I think it's the same thing with this, isn't it, where it's like, you want to villainize these two cannibal characters, but you kind of can't, because there is that feeling of sadness. Like, they don't want to do it, they want to control it, but they can't stop, kind of thing. And it's very human in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just, and you don't really know. You want to lay the blame on something or someone and stuff, and you can say, oh, it's the illness and stuff, but then you're like, well, this whole time he managed to not do it, so why is he doing that? So yeah, you're right. It's like, I think it's part of the uncomfortable feeling of the entire film, is that you're, even in the Beatrice Dalle scene, because as you say, like, she's moaning and stuff afterwards, and she feels really bad, and it's like, it's just uncomfortable. You're just like, you don't know what to do with that feeling. You don't know it's just sad. It's just really bad. It's
just really fucking sad.
It's
really
fucking
sad. It's really sad. So I mean, that's like the main. There's not much else to cover in terms of the story, because the story's pretty bare bones. I mean, there is that scene between Vincent Gallo and Beatrice Dalle, brief scene together that they have, obviously, and he kills her. And then at the end of the film, there's that moment when he's killed the maid, and then the wife comes back to the hotel, and they're like, okay, we're ready to head home now. And that's kind of the end of their honeymoon, isn't it? Doesn't exactly give you an optimistic feeling at the end of the film, does it? Like, you don't feel like that couple are gonna necessarily live happily ever after, I don't think.
Yeah, especially because I think there's this shot where she sees some blood, I think, on him or in the shower, I can't remember. And so we're wondering, like what? Like, does she know? Or is she just finding out? Or does she not care? Or what is that?
Yeah, is she choosing to ignore it and stay ignorant to this stuff that he's doing?
Is she like, as long as he doesn't hurt me, I don't care, or something? Because the fact is that he apparently can get away with it, so he might just go on living this way. He hasn't found a cure. He hasn't found anything, but because he's sort of seems like a respectable person, because he's not locked in a room. He can just lead his life, and if he kills a maid in a hotel, no one's gonna care about her. So there's also, I mean, you could, if you want, you could also like look at all these like sort of sociological interpretation of the film, which is like, he's a powerful American man coming to Paris, and he kills a poor like student maid girl who doesn't have as much power as he does, and that's the world we live in. That's just society. But I feel like that's it's interesting, because that's almost like the least interesting thing about the movie. Is like, usually those of horror films, like you can talk about them and like sound smart and stuff if you look at that sociological aspect. But in this film, it's like, that's actually the least interesting thing. Which is
you're so right. I was thinking that too. There is that element of, is there a comment here being made on the sort of the privilege of Vincent Gallo's character? Because of the four main characters, he's the straight white dude, right? And then we've got two women, and we've got a black man. And I wondered whether or not there was something that it was saying here, that the way in which these other three characters are having to suffer under his actions, essentially. And that feeling that he's able to kill the maid at the end and basically get away with it and carry on living his life. Yeah, it's there's a lot going on in this film for such a sort of simple story, isn't there?
I know it's like essentially 4 characters, maybe like there's a few others, but it's it's quite simple.
It is simple but effective. So we're going to move on to our second film of the week in a minute, but first of all, let's head on over to Wilde About Horror and hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wilde thinks of Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day.
Hey Mike, Mary Wilde here. It's the week before Christmas. Time to hang the mistletoe, wear fuzzy socks, prepare hot cocoa, and throw on a cozy movie like Claire Denis' French Extrmity horror film, Trouble Every Day, described in Film Freak Central as plaintive and sad, a rare combination of honesty, beauty, and maybe even genius. The story follows an American couple, Dr. Shane Brown and his wife June, honeymooning in Paris. A very romantic premise made complicated when we discover that Shane intends to hunt down a neuroscientist, Dr. Léo Simoneau, and his wife Corée, Shane's old flame and current obsession. Corée, played sensationally by Béatrice Dalle, is a cannibal. Assisted by her husband, she seduces random men, eats their flesh, and murders them. The fusion of sex and flesh consumption in Trouble Every Day reflects the concept of lovesickness, an affliction that can produce negative emotions when deeply in love, during the absence of a romantic partner, or when strongly held feelings are unrequited. Lovesickness has been studied as an actual disease. In 1915, Sigmund Freud rhetorically asked, "Isn't what we mean by falling in love a kind of sickness or craziness, an illusion, a blindness to what the loved person is really like?" Shane and June appear on the surface to be the perfect couple, attractive, stylish, vacationing in the most romantic city in the world, celebrating their marriage. But something's wrong. Shane becomes distant, unable to have sex with June. Fantasies invade his mind of June covered, absolutely drenched in blood. He seems to be preoccupied with another longing. His desire for Corée is all-consuming, putting him on a path of betrayal that threatens to destroy not only his marriage, but his very life. Trouble Every Day stages the entwined dual system of Eros and Thanatos, the love and death drives respectively. It's the inescapable tension at the heart of a honeymoon, an ambivalent and paradoxical state of pursuing the love instinct even while masochistically sabotaging and ruining the very thing we swear we cherish so much. Corée has a disease that renders her incapable of resisting the impulse to feast on human flesh. It's a symbol of unbridled passion, totally free of rationality and decorum, which turns Shane on, animating him, quite literally springing him into action. But what is the importance of flesh eating in this film, particularly in its graphic depiction? Freud's paper, Mourning and Melancholia, offers an insight here. Mourning is, of course, the natural grieving process, a conscious response to a physical death. Melancholia, however, is more abstract. It's an unconscious reaction to an unseen loss. Shane and June seem to have it all, but somehow they lack contentment. There's something missing in their lifestyle. In advanced societies, we often encounter what appears to be surplus. We are overexposed to the pleasure principle. The concept of happiness in this context is omnipresent, but also unattainable. We eventually go on to become desensitized to it. Excess and prolongment of enjoyment become tedious, painful even. When every great thing is promised to us, it is rather uncanny to find that we are numb, sad, or dead inside, a feeling close to what is described as depression or melancholia. Freud refers to melancholia as an open wound, a kind of emptying and hollowing out of the conscious personality until it is totally impoverished. There's no interest in the outside world. The ego is absorbed entirely in sadness. Crucially, there is also a regression to the oral stage of libidinal development, which Freud even compared to cannibalism. He wrote in the paper published in 1917 that the ego wants to incorporate the lost object into itself by devouring it. I think this is where the flesh-eating dimension in Trouble Every Day becomes theoretically relevant, pointing to a desire by a depressed subject to bring back what he believes he has lost into himself by gorging on it. This is reflected in Shane's fantasies of Corée and her insatiable desire to ingest human flesh. When he is away from Corée, Shane is restless, like a junkie having withdrawal symptoms. He longs to reintegrate into himself what he is sure evades him, passion and life-giving properties in his relationship with June. This reintegration takes the form of devouring. Thinking of Trouble Every Day, I'm reminded of a gay pornographic zombie horror film, LA Zombie, written and directed by Bruce LaBruce, about an alien zombie who may just be a schizophrenic vagrant who emerges from the sea and roams around Los Angeles, finding various deceased men across the city and reanimating their corpses in flagrantly risque ways. The dead men encountered by the zombie are victims of urban crime, homelessness, and drug warfare. Their bodies are brought back to life by the exclusive dedication of the zombie to the place where life is lacking. Somehow, in this act of devotion, an erotic revival takes place. As dysfunctional as it is, lifelessness represented in the consumption of flesh gives rise to a purpose, an erotic drive, which is also tragically at the center of Trouble Every Day, a film upon which we can hang multiple representations of the destructive impulse. Merry Christmas, everybody. Catch you in 2021.
A big thank you there to the amazing Mary Wild. Such a treat to have Mary with me every step of the way this series. It's really been such a great experience for me. Mary, thank you for all of your hard work this year, and Merry Christmas. More from Mary in the new year. But in the meantime, if you want to hear more from Mary, you can follow her at PsychStar on Twitter for information about her upcoming courses, and you can check out her podcast, the Projections Podcast, which she co-hosts with Sarah Cleaver. You can find that in all the normal places where you get your podcasts. Okay, before we move on, I want to take a quick moment to thank this week's sponsor, which is $20 patron Katie Davis. Katie is a long-time friend of the podcast. She has been really supportive of the podcast pretty much ever since the beginning. She's based out in the US, and so for a long time we were just sort of talking to each other over Twitter. But actually, I've had the pleasure of meeting Katie a couple of times as well. She came over for Fright Fest. She came to London for Fright Fest weekend, and then last year when me and Becky threw our Halloween party, she flew over for the Halloween party. So, I mean, Katie, you're an absolute legend. Katie has been so supportive of this podcast since the beginning. I know myself and loads of friends of the pod have all kind of gotten to know Katie over the last couple of years, and I think I speak for so many friends of EOH when I say it's been so great to get to know Katie. So, Katie, I want to say a huge thank you one more time for all of your support and for becoming a $20 patron and an official sponsor of the Evolution of Horror. Now, if you want to go and say hello to Katie, then follow her on Twitter @withjetpacks. She is a cinephile and she is always recommending great movies that she's watched. She also does a thing where she recommends sort of two movies together that make a great double bill. I've really enjoyed sort of checking out those recommendations and following along. So give her a little follow on Twitter and say hello. She's a legend. Katie also does a bit of writing and reviewing. She's written for the Evolution of Horror website. She recently wrote a review of Sam Ashurst's new movie, A Little More Flesh. And Katie also appears on the Smooth Thrills Radio Hour podcast, which you can find on all your podcast platforms. So one more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 donor and all-round awesome person, Katie Davis.
Santa Claus only brings presents to them that's been good all year. to the ones that ain't done nothing naughty. Naughty. All the other ones. All the naughty ones. He punishes.
That was a little clip you heard just there from cult Christmas classic Silent Night, Deadly Night from 1984, which is a little teaser of what we've got coming up this week on Patreon. It is, of course, the season to be jolly and the season to discuss gross out Christmas horror movies. So, over on Patreon, you guys voted for which 2 movies you wanted us to discuss, and we brought you a discussion of Silent Night, Deadly Night and Krampus, a double festive bill of deep dive discussions. I was joined by friends of the pod Becky Dark and Stevie Webb, and we had the best time discussing these 2 movies. If you want to hear that discussion, that will be available for $5 donors and upwards, and that episode will be dropping very, very soon. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror and sign up now. If you sign up at that $5 level, you'll get regular bonus episodes such as that one, as well as a whole back catalogue of other bonus episodes. But you can also go to a $10 level, which will give you weekly new bonus episodes and includes access to our exclusive bonus mini-seasons. We've just finished this week our mini-season on Twin Peaks, and in the new year we'll be kicking off our Hitchcock mini-season, which I just cannot wait to get started on. You can also sign up at a $20 level, and if you become a $20 patron, you get all of those treats, plus you become an Evolution of Horror sponsor like Katie Davis, and you'll also get sent a personalised video message from me as a thank you. Everybody who joins up at any tier will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if they're UK based, and everybody will get a very special shout out on the podcast. So, speaking of, I'm going to give everyone a very special thanks who signed up in the last couple of weeks. So a big thank you to Gary Short, Kat McCollum, Kitty Whitmarsh, Lars Anderson, Jacob Sleet, Ollie Menham, Henrik J, Rowan Tennant, Julia M, Peter Batzig, Elizabeth Boxer, Nicole Rowe, Richard, E.K. Spencer, Alex Hess, Wayne DeGoldie, Keith Bowman, Anton Yeisfelt, I'm really sorry if I massacred that, Coco, and our 600th patron, Richard Evans. A huge thank you to all of those people who signed up to our Patreon this week. And one more time, if you want to join them and be treated to regular bonus content as well as a whole bunch of other treats, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode and our final review of 2020. What better to wrap up the year and finish our Christmas episode than with this Christmas classic? Here comes our review of Inside from 2007.
Enfin, moi. Personne ne me le prendra. Personne lui fera du mal maintenant. Personne.
Inside is a nice simple story, isn't it? So this takes place at Christmas. I think it's Christmas Eve, or it's the night before Christmas Eve. And we've got a pregnant woman who is alone in her house. She's in a car accident at the beginning of the film, and her husband or the father of her baby is killed. And a woman turns up at her house and tries to get in, eventually breaks in, and essentially wants to take her baby away from inside her. And it turns out this woman was in this car crash with her and lost her child because of this car crash, and that's why she wants to steal our main character's baby. So it's a classic kind of, it's a home invasion film, it's a kind of cat and mouse film. It's kind of, there are quite a few characters that come in and out of it, but at the center of it, it's just two women in a house, right? What did you think of this one? Was this the first time watching it for you, Inside?
Yeah, I hadn't seen it before because I was scared.
Oh my god, yeah, I know. I'm so intrigued to hear what you thought. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked it. I was kind of surprised that I was quite upset by it at the time, but then afterwards I was fine, which I was quite happy about. That's great progress for me. I'm just getting better. But yeah, I really liked it. I thought it was there were loads of really interesting things in it, and I love the way that there were some moments where it almost felt like a student film, because it was so like lo-fi, and some performances I think are like bad, but in a way that's fun and interesting, and I like it. I wouldn't change it, you know. Yeah. I hear there's a remake of the film, but I haven't seen it, like an American remake.
No, yeah, that's right. I haven't seen it either, actually. I've never really.
I can't imagine that. Like I'll have to watch it just out of curiosity.
Yes.
But yeah, I really enjoyed the film. I thought it was like very, very upsetting as well, but in quite a different way, I think I would say. Like there's the way it reaches that sort of fever pitch of horror, and like you can't stand when you're watching. I think it's quite different, but really interesting.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's really interesting that you said like you know you've kind of felt okay afterwards. I think that's true, and I think it's because it feels much more like a traditional horror film, doesn't it? And I think in a way that you kind of feel a little bit of a catharsis at the end, like you kind of feel like you do at the end of a scary movie, where it's like, oh, okay, it's over now, kind of thing. Which I don't get at the end of Trouble Every Day.
No,
but you kind of do at the end of this one. I don't know whether it's just because it's a little bit more. I don't know. it's more like sort of high emotion, high stakes kind of proper horror film, isn't it? And it's got such a kind of over, like, so almost operatic kind of final act, and there's much blood and everything that it almost sort of takes you out of the realism in a way. I don't know.
And it gets a bit silly as well at the end, which is fun.
It does.
I'm grateful for that. I was like, oh, great, you might as well.
Yeah, totally. Because I don't know about you, I find home invasion as like a subgenre of horror very frightening. Like movies like The Strangers or whatever, you know, those sorts of films. How do you find them? That whole idea of kind of home invasion in movies.
Yeah, I think it's. It's one of the most horrible ones. But actually, I think it's interesting because it's obviously. I mean, inside they sort of make the connection between, you know, getting inside someone and getting inside their house. Yeah. You know, the way that it's not similarly scary, but like there's a correlation. There's something, a kinship between the two things. They make it like really literal and inside. But I think it's interesting because there's aspects of Trouble Every Day as well, and you know the fact that just the idea of cannibalism that's sort of similar. It's like someone getting into your private space, whether it's your body or your house, and that's why I think these two things, like cannibalism and maybe home invasion, are like not to the same degree, maybe not in exactly the same way, but like both very upsetting just as an idea. Just the idea of someone just coming in your house is just almost unthinkable. It's just too scary. It's just beyond.
That's right. And again, it's one of those big taboo subjects here. It's pregnant women in danger and babies in danger as well. I've learned about myself as an adult that I am not good with watching harm come to babies. There was a moment in Darren Aronofsky's Mother where I nearly walked out, so that is where my line is drawn, and that's why this movie I find particularly troubling. The way in which the directors choose to film a lot of scenes from inside the womb as well is really interesting. The opening scene, the car crash, we see the whole thing play out from inside the womb, and then there are scenes throughout the movie wherever our main character Sarah is being attacked or hurt, it suddenly cuts to this shot, right, of the baby in the womb looking really distressed and hurt. And I found that really upsetting. I found it really powerful as well. What did you think of those choices to shoot stuff, you know, inside the womb?
I don't know if I liked those shots as much as you did. I think they sort of took me out of like they made everything. I think if anything, it would have been almost scarier to never see the baby until the end, obviously. Because it's like you have no idea how he's doing. Like if you have no idea how the baby's doing, because like I have no idea what it's like. Like if you're pregnant and you have a huge belly, like I have no idea how much like kicks or whatever. Like I don't know, and I think the fact that I have no idea how much a baby in the belly can take is like scarier than if I can see the baby and he's moving around and stuff. And also, I mean, it doesn't help that the effects were quite bad, but I'm quite forgiving about effect stuff so it's fine. But yeah, I think it would have been almost scarier if we didn't see the baby. So.
Yeah, fair enough. I know what you mean, actually. I mean, because you know, even in the final act, that baby is still alive. And I guess maybe that is something, I don't know, in a weird way, that felt like a slightly more optimistic ending than Trouble Every Day, even. I don't know why. You know, obviously the main character is dead, but the fact that the baby survives, it was like a glimmer of hope there.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost like a very like ironic thing, like almost like supposed to be darkly funny or something, where it's like, oh, all this, and still the baby's alive, you know. It's like really like perverse, I think, in a way. And considering that the stuff that happens at the end is so extreme and like exaggerated, like, you know, bit silly, I think it's almost like part of the like humor of the film, if I can say that.
I think that's true. And I was even thinking about, I was probably thinking too much into it, but I was thinking about it in the context of A Christmas Story too, like a kind of like the kind of Mary and Jesus virgin birth thing, where you've got this like mother and baby at the end, and the mother didn't actually give birth to the baby, but this like mother and child at the end on Christmas Eve, you know. And I think it is like a really dark, twisted joke almost, or like satire of a kind of Christmas story in a way, you know.
I hadn't thought about that actually, but that's a really good point. I don't think you're reading too much into this. I think this is the level of the film. I think that the film has, I think there's also stuff in this film where they're trying to make it about things in a way that I think is like not necessarily super convincing, but sort of I can see like, oh yeah, they try to like the stuff with the riots in France.
Yeah. What did you think of that? Weird. Yeah, the film makes a clear point, doesn't it, to sort of to mention over and over again that elsewhere outside of this house in Paris, there are riots going on, there's social unrest, there are criminals, there are cops, there's a lot of violence going on in the streets. What did you think that added to the film?
I think that's the thing. I can't, if I watch the film and like look at all that stuff, I'm like, I don't think it adds up at all. I think and so I'm more tempted to think, is the filmmakers trying to pretend that they're saying something about the world, about France at the time, which I'm just not convinced by, because it's like, I think the idea is that this one incident of this woman just like going mental and trying to steal some woman's baby is like sort of a symptom of like a bigger sort of unrest in France or something like that, which I'm not, I mean, that's the only sort of explanation I can find, and I'm not like really convinced by it.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably and I think it's connected to the fact that when at some point in the film there's these cops who come in the house, and with them, they have a kid who clearly like of Arabic origins, which is the kind of people that the cops like to arrest because they think they're doing bad things and like riots and things. I think that's also supposed to say something. I think in the film, I think the filmmakers are trying to pretend that it says something. That the fact that this guy is like an innocent teen, or like basically he's like really young, just chained to this cop who's going in this insane house. It's almost like he's being dragged into things in the fights of people who have like who do not have his problems. And so I think that's supposed to be about that. That's supposed to be about like French society and how there's like this misplaced anger and I don't know. I think it's like so really vague and not convincing at all. Like, I don't care about it.
It's quite ambitious, isn't it? It's clearly like trying to do a lot of stuff, I think, this film.
But I don't even know if it's trying to really do that. I think it was almost like added afterwards or something. The thing about the riots, it just doesn't feel...
Well, I think there's that idea, isn't there, that you mentioned at the very beginning of this chat that maybe these films are in some way about social fear and anxiety and unrest at the turn of the millennium, but rather than make them big stories about government and about, you know, whatever, these are small, contained personal stories. Trouble Every Day, obviously, like you mentioned, there's the link to the song Trouble Every Day, which maybe has a social message to it. And this movie, there is a kind of peripheral social commentary going on outside, but I can't help but think that stuff all kind of messes the simple narrative a little bit. I wonder whether if we didn't have all of those characters coming in and out, you know, the different the cops and the criminal and the mother and the boss, and if it had just been a two-hander, if it had just been these two women in this house throughout the entire film, it would have been probably even more unbearable and intense. But I wonder if it would have been a better film in a way.
Yeah, I think so too, especially because it's like you know, the fact that she lives in a house that's just there's nothing around, like it's all in boxes and things.
Yeah, I
think it's like it helps the film be sort of almost this completely abstract thing, abstracted from reality, where it's just two women in a house in like, you know, white walls, like there's nothing around. It's like it's almost not the real world. It's just like sort of this I think what's really great about this and the way this all abstracted, and the reason why I think there shouldn't be the cop stuff and all the society things, is because you have all this empty space, and because it's like this conflict is reduced in most of the scenes where it's just the two women in this house, it's reduced to like the essence of the fear, which is you're pregnant, someone wants to get your baby and kill you.
Yeah.
That's so much more effective because you as an audience can relate to that fear on like a primal level. Like everyone, I don't think anyone can look at the image of a belly next to a big knife or a big pair of scissors and be like comfortable. You know what I mean? It's like there's something really primal about it, which is sort of similar to the cannibalism, I think, in Trouble Every Day. It's like, it's just a taboo. It's just you don't want to think about that. And I think 100%. That's to do a film where you have all that in this completely abstracted space, empty space, is just so much more effective because you're just in that feeling, which everyone has had. You know, sometimes you're like late at night going to sleep, you just think about all the most fucked up things you can think about. And so everyone can relate to that fear. And I think that's what a lot of French extremism does really well, is to sort of relate to like these really, really primal fears that everybody's got. And so you're right, it's like almost like a welcome distraction when these guys come in, because your art is to film. Like, this is like a specific story. This is not like this is like a break from me thinking, like, being in that emotion. But I agree that it makes it less powerful.
It gives us a moment to breathe, doesn't it? Which, like, in the moment is fine by me. But yeah, I think you're right. I think when you think about it more objectively, it's like, oh, I wonder how much more tense it would have been if it was just just those two, and that woman had locked herself in the bathroom and we were just stuck with her through most of it, you know. But what do you think of these two characters then? I mean, let's start with the character of Sarah. We don't really learn that much about her, do we? And she's not a particularly like warm character, but she's clearly been through a lot, right? That we is revealed at the very beginning of the film. But it's interesting how the story doesn't really invite you to learn much about her or anything before she gets into this plight, right?
Yeah, I think it's like the scenes at the beginning where it's just her getting out of the hospital and being set in a park. It's like they're quite interesting because like they sort of present her as this really sort of aggressive person. Like she's not nice to anyone. Yeah. But also she seems to be living in a sort of version of France where everyone's like really perverse and horrible, and just everybody just wants something from her. And I really like that. I feel like that's so French, like to create this like this world where everyone's really mean and just got their own interest, and like they're just going to say what they want to say, and you're like, oh, fuck off, you know. It's like it's so French, you know. So I feel like I like those scenes because it sort of gives you the sense that she lives in like a sort of extreme a world of complete alienation where there's no warm feeling between anyone. And that's why then when someone rings the door, obviously that's going to be someone bad, because that's the only reason people interact in this universe.
Yes.
But yeah, I thought she was interesting. I thought the actress was pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
She was all right. I'm not like nothing crazy, but I thought she was good.
Yeah, the one thing I find quite interesting about the character is that they don't do a great deal to make us warm to her, and actually they do something that again is still, even to this day, right, considered a bit of a taboo. This idea that she's a bit of a reluctant, expectant mother. You know, she's not got that happiness, that glow that she's, you know, expecting a baby. She seems not that fast, or if anything, actually maybe a bit resentful. Maybe in some way she connects this baby to the death of her partner in that car crash or something. I don't know. I feel like the film maybe teases that a little bit, that this is not a woman who is at her heart, you know, naturally maternal like so many film mothers should be.
It's interesting actually, because it's like, yeah, she's like this mother to be, and she's got all these negative emotions, and she's not really thinking about the baby in this way where people are like, oh, I love my baby, I can't wait to, you know, very maternal. But then the woman who wants to, there's this woman who arrives who wants to get her baby, who's very much in a maternal instinct. So she's like, I'm a mother, I will kill people to get a baby so I can be a mother. So it's like sort of the extreme of the other way.
Yeah, you're so right. And actually in a really perverse way, that character, the woman with her kind of real violent maternal instinct, is the more socially acceptable figure of a mother, right? That will risk everything and will do anything to have and protect and keep that baby. And ultimately she does. She wins out. That motherly instinct wins at the end of the film. What did you think of her, that character? You know, she doesn't even have a name, I don't think. I think she's just credited as the woman. Also played by Beatrice Dahl, right? Who was, you know, in Trouble Every Day.
Well, actually, it's interesting because I think it's quite similar in a way, the sort of selfishness of the character, and the way she again transgresses this taboo like boundary, which is the belly of a pregnant woman, to get what she wants. So it's another form of transgression. Like in cannibalism, she would just eat a guy because she wanted to, no matter how fucked up that is. Yeah. And here it's like she like pierces a woman's tummy to get the baby. So it's like, I think it isn't. The casting of Beatrice Dahl has to be a conscious decision. Yes. I mean, she's also got this amazing face and these great teeth that are like very scary, which Claire Denis uses really well in Trouble Every Day.
Oh my God,
she's always showing her teeth that she looks like she could eat, you know, cardboard or anything. This is amazing. Yeah, I think she's like, I really like the way she plays this character, because it's like, I think one thing that makes her so scary is that she's always walking so very slowly and casually. And it's funny, I think the fact that she's got this sort of really goth outfit with this like corset thing is quite funny, which I really liked it because it was really funny. And I can imagine this woman like building that sort of persona in her head where she's like a avenging like mother figure. But I think the fact that she moves so slowly and like just sort of sneaks around and doesn't seem bothered, she doesn't really rush around at all, it just makes it so much more, obviously so much scarier. I was thinking, it made me think of the way Michael Myers moves, obviously in Halloween. And loads of like villains since whose thing is to walk very slowly but with determination. So I thought she was great. She was terrifying.
She was terrifying, and you're right, like she never seemed particularly phased, and like you kind of felt like she always had a plan and that she was ultimately going to win, which she does as well. And that is quite scary. She's much more, because we've talked recently about the sort of female psychopaths in all of those films from the 80s and 90s, like Fatal Attraction and Misery and all those films are much more kind of like over the top, I suppose. I mean, this woman is very over the top as well, of course, but I think there is that kind of, like you say, almost more Michael Myers-esque, kind of like very controlled and composed as well, which makes her quite frightening. And the outfit is amazing.
I know. I can't explain it. Like, I don't understand why they did that. It's so funny. Like, everything else in the film is quite like realistic and very 2006 or 7 or whatever, and she just shows up like that.
I know. I love
respect.
it. Respect, exactly. But it is scary. Like, that's the thing. It's like, I found this traditionally scary in like the classic sense. Like the tension of where is she in the house? You know, the creepy photo that Sarah takes of her outside the window, and then like kind of when and where she's going to pop up, and it is a really frightening thing. It's claustrophobic, and I thought all of the horror was played really well. And then, of course, we get some of the most horrific gore, like kind of uncomfortable, disturbing gore. Like even the very first moment when she gets into the house and she pierces her belly for the first time with the scissors is just like, I almost had to cover my eyes, you know? It's like...
I cover my eyes. One thing I need to say is that I always cover my eyes through these films, but I still... it's horrible. Also, she takes ages to start it in the first time. I mean, the last time as well. But she takes ages to like get the scissors out and stuff. And I think that's the same thing. It's like this thing, you're just like, no, they're not going to do that. That's just too much. I think what's really interesting about is that the idea alone, or like just the simple juxtaposition of a belly and a big pair of scissors is already enough. Like it's just the idea of it alone is terrifying. And to then go beyond that, because most of us are used to, or even in films, whenever there's a suggestion or something like this, I think it stops there. You know, it stops at the suggestion or like just this juxtaposition of the two things, and you do the rest. You're like you imagine, and you're like, oh god, no. And this film, like you're imagining, and then it does it as well. So you're like, no, you don't have. You're just looking at the screen like, no, you don't need to do that. I know, I get it.
I agree, and it's like it's paced in such a way that it's like makes it excruciating. Like you say, it takes so long to get to those moments as well. It's not like bam, shock, stab. It's like like they let you know that it's coming, and so you get more and more upset, and then a lot of films would then cut away from that, or something would happen and somebody would burst in and save them at the last second. But it's like, no, it does just happen. And actually and it's something to do with the specific parts of the body, I think. Like, it's funny what gore you can take and what gore you can't, because I was okay, for example, with the Sarah getting her hand pinned to the wall. I was like, I've seen that in other films. It's still gross, but I've seen it. Even her doing the kind of tracheotomy in her neck, like that was pretty gross. But again, I feel it didn't like upset me in the way that the belly stuff did. You know, like I don't know what it is. It's like different areas of the body and different, I don't know, different connections and associations, I suppose, in different ways. You know?
I think that goes far back into like the way humans are like conditioned by the world we grew up in, and the stuff we accept and the stuff we don't. So. But it's interesting to see films use such like primal like instincts that we have to frighten us. Yeah,
totally.
Primal way.
And again, like I said earlier, like I found one of the most shocking moments, that moment when the guy who had been blinded just walloped her in the stomach really hard with like I can't remember what it is, like a bat or something. And like that kind of like violence, again, knowing that is a pregnant woman and that's a baby. Again, it felt like a really kind of taboo, shocking moment,
Exactly.
And there's a lot of blood too. I mean, I don't know whether you covered your eyes, but in, of course, like the final like pièce de résistance, the big like final set piece in which the C-section happens on the stairs. It's so gross because it's so long, and also there's just like you see the shots of just blood just pouring
going down the stairs.
So
I thought that was almost funny, to be fair, because I was just like, that's just the idea of blood going down the stairs like that. I've never thought about that. That's just crazy.
It's
just quite a funny image.
I think you're right. I think it eventually pushes over to a point where it becomes so extreme that you can almost like breathe a sigh of relief that it's become more like silly. I get that in the Saw films, right? The Saw films, like the violence is so extreme, the gore is so extreme that I'm like, okay, it's no longer making me kind of like wince. It's just kind of funny in how extreme it is. And I think the final scene of Inside finally gets to that place, doesn't it, where it's like it's gone over the top by that point.
I mean, there's so many bits at the end that are just so I was watching, I was like, okay, well, this is a different film. Like even before the C-section scene where she suddenly gets the knife into the sort of, she creates this contraption with the knife and the Hoover thing, and she's got like this big weapon, and she's like, okay, I'm going to attack this. Like, what is that? When did she become such a like smart woman to like who's going to just make up a weapon? I was like, this is like a different film. What's going on?
The choices of weapons are hilarious as well, because it's like the Hoover, it's like knitting needles and scissors and stuff. It's all like, it's very domestic stuff, I suppose, isn't it? All of it again kind of makes it all feel a bit more relatable in a weird way. But it is, I think it like in a good way, this movie felt more to me like a kind of classic roller coaster ride horror film, in the way that I was able to kind of handle it a bit more than like some other French extreme movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how do you think it's? I mean, it's like, 13 years old now. How do you think it holds up? How do you think it's aged? Especially given that you watched this for the first time this year.
Well, obviously, I mean, the CGI is pretty terrible. Even I think for 2007, I think it's pretty bad. Like you probably had. I don't think it's quite a low budget movie, so it's fine. But I think, I mean, I can't really think what was the last time that we had such a horrible scene in a film to that degree. I think one scene actually that I'm always thinking about is the degloving scene in Gerald's Game.
Oh, me too.
That's probably the last really huge horror like moment gore that I can remember in a film so recently. But I think the film, I mean, I've only seen it yesterday, but it seems to me that it's still very effective, because it's not like you've seen a C-section scene in many films since. I don't think it's become a common thing.
I think it's really interesting how horror changes, because I really do think that like we don't get horror films like we did in the noughties anymore. Like that wave of like French Extreme and Eli Roth films and the Saw films, like that's kind of gone out of popularity right now. And in horror, it's much more like, Hereditary or ghost stories or psychological stuff. And that kind of like relentless gore is not quite so prevalent, I don't think, anymore in the horror genre. It's quite interesting to kind of look back on this decade at just how nasty films were actually like 10 years ago.
It seems like we're like way less interested in gore now or something. I don't know why. But then if you think about like Hereditary, there's also some quite taboo things there, like decapitation. Yeah, that's also, I think, quite. If the film was made by a French person, we'd probably like see it or something. I don't know. But like, I feel like there's a sort of similar sort of taboo feeling to it, like a sense of transgression.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is like. Hereditary is really troubling and extreme, but more in a sort of psychological way, I suppose, than a kind of visceral, gory way. Yeah. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting little era. Do you have any other favourites before we wrap up from this era? I mean, I say favourites. I mean, have you seen, like, for example, Martyrs or Irreversible or any of those other ones?
I really like Martyrs, actually. I mean, that's one of the ones I watch when I watch loads of them, just to like...
Oh, God. It's really upsetting, Martin.
It's really upsetting, but I thought it actually, I can't remember all the details, but I remember by the end being like, yes, this is great. Like, despite the disgust and like absolute terror I was feeling, I felt like it was absolutely worth it. Yeah. Which isn't necessarily always the case with those films. Like sometimes you're like, oh yeah, okay, but also like, whereas this time I was like, this is like really intelligent, really smart, and like, I am thrilled to a degree that I have not been thrilled in a while. And I also really like High Tension, Haute Tension.
Yes.
Haute Tension.
It's also got, I think the English title is Switchblade Romance for
Switchblade
some reason.
Romance, yes.
I prefer High Tension, but anyway.
I know, it's great. And there's also another one that feels quite more like a sort of classical film, because it's like it's amazing roller coaster. Like, I don't want to say anything to spoil for people, but it's very upsetting gore stuff, but it's also like a narrative, so it's pretty safe. You're not like traumatized by it.
Yeah, nice. It's really that's really extreme. Actually, that feels like much more probably that it was more influential on like the American horror stuff that came after it. I think it feels more like that. It almost feels more like you're watching something like Hills Have Eyes or Texas Chainsaw or something like that, doesn't it? That film. It's really fun. Yeah,
it's great.
That's a good one. Amazing. Well, there you go. We've talked about some grim, bleak French stuff there. That was really, really fun. Is this going to be something you'll revisit in future Christmases, Elena? Inside?
Well, I'm still actually planning on watching some Saw films.
Oh my God, amazing.
That's actually a Christmas tradition we have to watch Saw films.
Oh, I love it.
2 at a time. So I think I've already seen the ones that we're watching next like twice already. So I'm probably not even going to blink, you know.
Oh my God, I'll have to get you guys back. I have to get you guys back on, because on my Patreon, I'm about to do like a rewatch of the whole Saw franchise.
Oh wow!
So we're going to do like a discussion of every single film.
That's actually quite good, because I always struggle to remember which is which and what the story is, because it's really confusing.
You kind of have to. I think it's like I've been told that they're actually better to watch like really in quick succession, because it's almost like watching a TV show where it's like it carries straight on from where the previous one left off, doesn't it?
Yeah, and every subsequent film doesn't really try to like bring you up to date with stuff. If you just assume you've seen the previous one yesterday, that you can follow up. It's really confusing. I've sort of like given up on the story now. I'm just concentrating on like the traps, because I just can't remember. I just get so confused.
I know it gets to some point in the 4th, 5th or 6th where like there's a new character who's like a policeman who's also a villain and stuff, and it's like at that point it kind of really starts to confuse me. But yeah. And
there's also 2 actors who look like a lot very similar.
Exactly the same. Yeah. The good guy and the bad guy look identical. I remember that. Yeah. It's really
nonsense.
It's nonsense. Such fun nonsense. I love it. Amazing. Well, Elena, thank you so much for joining me to discuss these films. It's been so much fun. Where can people find you? And if they want to come find you and more stuff that you've written and that kind of thing, where can they find details of that online?
Well, I think probably the best way is on my Twitter, which is at @Lazic, ELAZIC. And I also have a WordPress called elenalazic.wordpress.com with all my writing on it. And I also have a Patreon, actually, where I write about films I've seen that I have something to say about, like, regularly.
Very cool. Excellent. Yeah. All right, cool. All right, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad I could actually get out some of those emotions and try to rationalize them in words.
I know.
So get them out of my mind.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Elena Lazic. Such a treat to have her back on the podcast to discuss these two absolute gems. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on these two strange and challenging and shocking movies. What do you think of Trouble Every Day and Inside? Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's movies with fellow listeners, then head on over to our discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast on our website, evolutionofhorror.com. One more time, if you want to support this podcast financially and be treated to regular bonus episodes, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. If you want to support this podcast but you can't afford to do so financially, we would be hugely grateful if you could spare a minute to leave us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts. This really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, well that's it. It's time to say farewell to the year 2020, and I think I speak for everyone when I say good fucking riddance, 2020. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, which, according to my calendar, is New Year's Day. And we've got possibly the cheeriest, most fun movie ever made to discuss on New Year's Day. It's not cheery, it's not fun. In fact, the next episode of this podcast, we are finally going to be covering a movie that people have probably been asking me about since this podcast began 3 years ago. We're going to be discussing one of the most shocking and disturbing and notorious horror movies ever made. Next time on the podcast, I'm going to be joined by two very special guests, co-host of the Faculty of Horror, Alex West, and co-host of the Gaylords of Darkness and blogger for Final Girl, Stacey Ponder. And we are going to be discussing Pascal Laugier's Martyrs from 2008. Merry Christmas, everybody.